it's a little windy and cold outside. So it's nice to be in and to check one of these talks out. So um, I will say with this talk, I've had a lot of fun putting it together because as the person who has all of the numbers, I get to look at them, and that's very exciting to me, to see what we've done, because I certainly haven't been around for all the counts. And so what we're going to do is work through what I have with history. So I'm part of being a compiler, at least the way that I'm approaching it is I want to try to collect a little more history pieces. So I'm going to present sort of what I have, but I would definitely welcome suggestions. If you've got information, I would love to hear it, about especially the older counts, the 50s and 60s, like that sort of stuff. We don't have a lot of information about those counts. So we'll talk about what we've got, and then we'll just look at a few trends. Certainly not an exhaustive list of trends, but just some of the things that I've found very interesting by looking at the data as we go along. And we'll scoot ahead. So just if you're not familiar with Christmas bird counts, we're just going to take a couple of minutes and cover the ground of what a Christmas bird count is, maybe a little bit of the background history for those who might want it, and then talk about the Duluth count. And so this year will be the 123rd annual Audubon Christmas bird count. This was something that started as a way to kind of promote conservation through kind of counting and observation as opposed to killing birds. It's a story that we hear a lot of when we think about early conservation. We could think about Hawk Ridge, counting birds instead of shooting them. We can think about Christmas bird counts, lots of different things. But it was coordinated by some conservationists who were just interested in doing something else and saying, we're tired of hunting and shooting these birds and not doing anything with them. It wasn't like it was a sporting event or anything. It was just people going out and shooting birds on Christmas because that's what they could do. And so in the year 1900, Christmas birds counts started. 27 folks got together to do 25 different Christmas bird counts across North America, really. And since that start, we now have at least a count in every state and through 20 countries, mostly in North America and South America. I think there's probably a couple in Europe, but for the most part, it's a kind of a North America, South America thing. If you're interested in those first counts, here you go. The most curious thing from this list is that it was very east skewed, right? So it was New York State and Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. But if you dig through that list a little bit, I hope you can see that there are 2 Canadian provinces, New Brunswick and Ontario, that are represented. Folks as far west as Monterey County, California. In our area, there were two counts, in Illinois and in Sauk County in Wisconsin. And so it was a pretty broad-reaching count. It was very informal back then. Certainly wasn't as standardized as we have it now. But it was really interesting. A total of 89 species were counted on the first count across all of those states and provinces, which is really kind of cool. But since the beginnings, one thing has kind of remained intact, and that is the time frame. Christmas counts now take place between the 14th of December and the 5th of January. There are certainly a little bit of wiggle room with counting in those windows, but that's the dates, December 14th to January 5. The regional count compiler, so myself or someone else similar, would pick a day in that window to set as the count. And traditionally, it's about the same time. And so the Duluth count has sort of always been usually the first opportunity that is a weekend in that first week of December of the count. So this year it'll be December 17th. It's been as early as the 15th, I think, since I've been here. I'm sure there's been December 14 counts in Duluth too. And then it varies pretty widely throughout there. But basically you have that day and you have teams or groups of people that cover a 15-mile diameter circle to count birds. Every bird you can in that window. Generally, you could think of it as 24 hours, usually because it's a winter count. Sun up to probably sundown, maybe a little bit later to listen for owls. And participation can be incredibly variable. It could be, you take a walk down your block and that's all you do. You could have, a square mile or more to cover by yourself. You could be on skis, you could be riding your bike, you might be snowshoeing. So it's really widely variable how you can participate in that bird count. And if we look at Minnesota, right now we've got 87 active counts in Minnesota. All of these circles that you see are places that have a Christmas bird count that is active this year. And I say that because there are different colored dots, right? All those colors really mean are who has set a date and who hasn't. All the red circles are counts that have set dates. All the blue circles are counts that have not yet set dates. So in 2 weeks, this is going to be a totally different looking map. But you can kind of see there's pretty good coverage in Minnesota. Certainly in the southeast corner, there's maybe a little room there, kind of Fillmore County and east. And certainly north central Minnesota might have some room for a count if you wanted to start one. But for the most part, we've got some pretty good coverage throughout our state. And if we look at our region, these are the counts that are active in our region, and I'm using region very broadly, so interpret it as you will. But basically in the Duluth vicinity, we have 4, 5 counts. So the Duluth count, the Friedenberg count, 2 Harbors, the Carleton Cloquet count, and then Superior also has a Christmas bird count. Because this is the map for Minnesota counts, we don't have the Wisconsin counts, but Superior counts. And then further north and east, the Bog's got a count. There's a count in Hibbing, up on the range in Virginia, over in the Hoyt Lakes area. Cook has a Christmas bird count. Isabella has a Christmas bird count. So we are pretty bird busy, and I think partly that has to do with the people who are leading those counts. We do have a lot of birders in northeastern Minnesota, and so it sort of makes sense that we have a lot of bird counts. It's something that birders like to do, especially in the middle of winter. And so if we think just about our count, we're not going to necessarily cover the whole history. Like I said, I only have bits and pieces of it, but we're going to do our best to sort of give you a good idea. And so our counts in Duluth have been conducted since 1938. The first bird count in Minnesota was in 1906. And so it took us a little while to get started, but 1938 was the first count. And more or less, we've had a count every year since 1947. Or 48 rather. So 4 years with no counts, all during World War II or leading up to World War II, there were no Christmas bird counts. But in 1948, they started up again. And the big caveat to say about our Christmas bird count is that the circle has changed a number of times. And for a period of that time, there really wasn't a circle at all. And so the idea of that 15 diameter count circle has certainly developed and changed since the 1930s. But most importantly, we have had a consistent count circle since 1980. So the last 42 Christmas bird counts have happened in the same circle, which is really important and something that we'll talk about when we look at analysis of data here. And like I said, really early on, there wasn't a circle at all. I don't have any data about 1938 to 1954. And so again, something to look ahead to is when I get that data, I'll be really excited because I'll fill in some gaps. But for the most part, just by looking at the counts, so looking at the numbers of birds counted, it's pretty obvious that the first maybe 5 or 6 counts were only done by a couple of people, just based on counting under 100 birds, basically. You could do that from your backyard and count under 100 birds in a day. So, and again, just not terribly many people participating in those early counts, which sort of makes sense again. But from 1955 on, I've got some pretty good data. And so we can look at that a little bit closer. So since 1955, there have been 6 different count circles with 8 different compilers. And so not all of these circles have the same longevity. Some of them just shifted a little bit. Somebody shifted it back once. And so there's some changes there. But we'll look at circles in a second. As far as participation goes, we've had a lot of people participate in this count. Over 1,500 people have participated in the Duluth Christmas bird count. I'm sure that number is probably well over 1,600 or 1,700 by now. Almost 400 people have submitted feeder reports. So during the count, you can have an area and walk it and run it and do all those things with your group. or you could submit a report from your bird feeder in your backyard, or a yard count, right? And so almost 400 folks have submitted feeder reports since the start of the count, which is really cool. And like I said, compilers have had some good consistency, but the circles, of course, have had some changes. And so if we look at compilers, this is the history that I have for you. And we'll kind of run through the list here a little bit. In the early counts with Ole Finseth, 1955 and 56 had the same definition of their count. So the count included the North Shore from Knife River all the way down to the St. Louis River estuary, basically. So a big long line. In 1957, that expanded a little bit, included St. Louis Bay. And so we had along the shore and then a little bit of the waterway. So it seemed to me, at least from what the data looks like, that that's where the count was pretty close to the shore. Gary Koyava took over and moved the circle to Lake Avenue and Superior Street. So we had sort of a defined center, and then we had a bit of a circle in 1958 at least. When Jan Green took over in 1960, she moved the circle again to the Tisher Creek and Superior Street. So where Tisher Creek crosses Superior Street, that was the count center for 1960 and 61. In the middle there, you see Joe Brownell took over for a year, moved the circle back to Lake Avenue and Superior Street, and then Jan took it back to Tisher Creek in 1963. So from 1963 to 74, we had a count circle that stayed in one place, Tisher Creek and Superior Street, where the center was. When Jerry Niemi took over, he didn't shift the circle, so the circle stayed in place for those 4 counts. And then when Kim took the count over in 1979, he moved it again. So he moved the count circle to 55th East Superior Street. That's where the center was. And then jumped up to Hawk Ridge. So presently, so 1980, the present circle was set by Kim at the Hawk Ridge Overlook is where the center of our circle is right now. And that's the way it's been for the last 42 counts. So all through Kim, the rest of Kim's reign, from Jim's coordination and compilation, and from mine right now, that's what we've got for our count circle. If we just take the notable compilers, I would say mostly because of their longevity. Jan Green, she established the second most consistent count. So potentially we could use data from 1960 to 1978 and do a whole different analysis there. But she compiled 14 different counts. The count circle she established was used for 18 counts. So that's pretty significant in the Duluth Christmas bird counts. Then Kim took and established our present count circle, which, like I said, has been going for 42 counts. And he compiled for 20 counts, gave it over to Jim Land. Jim took over and then went for 20 counts. And then I took over from Jim. And so I probably have 20 counts in me as well, it seems, if we keep the trend going with the data here. But if we look at the circle, this was Jan Green's circle. So this is her circle at Tisher Creek and Superior Street. So you can kind of see how much it covers, right? We got a lot of inland area that gets covered, but there's a lot of water, and there's also a lot of Wisconsin. Not to say that you couldn't have a Christmas bird count that borders a state. If we looked at Minnesota again, Fargo-Moorhead area has a bird count that straddles the state line. The Grand Forks count straddles the line. There's a count in Ellsworth, Wisconsin that straddles the Minnesota line. So it's not uncommon for that to happen. But Kim moved it just a little bit further north and east. So here's Kim's circle. This is the present circle. You can see reaching all the way up to the French River and just clearing Wisconsin. There's a little bit of Wisconsin's water that we include in the count. But if you notice what happened there, just by shifting it north a little bit, we've added a lot of this kind of almost boreal forest habitat. So getting up close to Emerson Road and along Haugeniessen and places like that. There's a lot of good bog and a lot of really diverse habitat there to go along with kind of more urban habitat in Duluth. So this is our present circle. This is where all of our counting happens. And so if we think about the circle, and that's a big place, we think about all those folks, how did we do, or how have we done historically? Well, there are a few considerations to make. I didn't know that I didn't have access to this data when I started this talk. So I don't have any temperature data to consider, and I don't have count effort data. And I mentioned that off top because those two are really important especially if we want to have really robust interpretations of the data, we really need to make sure that we can standardize it and we can look at some anomalies, right? We'll see some anomalies when we talk about what I've seen trend-wise. So I don't have that information to consider, which means we're only going to be able to look at generalized trends. So only generally, this is what the numbers show us. This is what we can see. Here's what we can interpret based on those trends. And I'm also only going to consider data from 1980 on, which is a lot of data. That's 42 counts worth of data, because it was the most consistent. That circle we've had, and it hasn't changed. And so that's the data we're going to look at as we're moving ahead. And so generally, through the whole count, so the whole life of this count, we've counted over 547,000 birds have been counted. We're nearing that magical 550,000, which might happen this year, question mark, hopefully. Through, again, the whole duration of the count, we've documented 147 species. We've also documented an additional 23 other groups, right? So hybrids, we've documented common merganser, or common goldeneye, hooded merganser hybrids. We've documented American black duck mallard hybrids. We have a Nelson's gull on the record, which is glaucous herring hybrid. We've got a number of subspecies that we keep track of too, so Oregon juncos and birds like that. And we have a couple additional SPAs. If you're not familiar with a SPA, that would be if you've got, let's say, a finch flew by you, but you couldn't tell what it was. You couldn't tell if it was a goldfinch or a redpoll or a siskin. You could just document that as a finch and as a finch SPA, and that would count. So we've got waxwing and finch SPA and those sorts of things. So about 170 different birds, if we put birds in quotations there, that we've documented on this count. So really kind of interesting there. And again, generally, very few declines, at least apparent decline. So if you look at that map and you look at the data and the chart there, there hasn't been much of a decline in any species, which is really cool. That might change when I get access to count effort, because if we can standardize effort to the number of birds seen, that gives us a little better idea of if there was a decline or not. And so we'll look into that once I get that data. And we do have a few species with an obvious increase. And so I was expecting we might see some increases and some decreases when I was starting to look at the data. But I wasn't expecting who. The who is very interesting, and we will talk about it as we go on. If you really like concrete numbers, here you go. We're going to have some charts. We're going to have some graphs. So get ready for it, everybody. But this is the average numbers of species counted. And I broke it down by sort of major era, right? So the initial counts until now, if we considered all of that data, so the 80 total Christmas bird counts that have happened in Duluth, we've got an average of about 45 species. So the adjusted number here, what you're seeing there is the inclusion of subspecies and that sort of stuff. The total would be the total number of definable species. And so if we take out those early data, let's say we didn't like them, we could look at 1948 on. We've had some consistency there. So how does that? Well, we add a couple more species. But let's say we just want to consider the present circle. From 1980 until the last count last year, we're averaging about 56 species per count, which is pretty cool. It certainly varies up and down from there, but 56 species of bird overwinter in the Duluth area, more or less. And we look at another metric, right? If you like highs and lows, let's look at it. High counts on your left, lows on your right. 73 species is our high count. That's the most that we've counted on a Christmas bird count in Duluth, which is unbelievable. If you think about what December looks like in Duluth, 73 species is a lot, which is why, again, I wish I had temperature data, because I bet 2001 was a little warm, just based on that. I also then would bet that 1982 was a little bit cold. 43 species is a good, 13 birds under our average. That means there's probably some count effort issues there. People weren't spending all day outside. It was a little cold. The numbers of individuals, though, are a little more interesting, I think. The highest count, the highest individual total we've had on a count is just under 1,600 or 16,000 birds counted. I will say the two highest counts, so this one, the other one being just a shade over 15,500 birds counted, happened in years where there were a lot of just two species. I will tell you that the 1987 Christmas bird count had almost 8,000 pigeons. That's a lot of pigeons, and that makes up a lot of that number. Almost half of the birds counted in that Christmas bird count were pigeons. And then there were about 4,000 Bohemian waxwings counted that year. So a huge flight year for Bohemian waxwing. And if we look into the next count, I think it was 2005, another year where there were over 1,000 mallards counted, and a year with about 2,000 pine siskins. So usually when we have these huge numbers, it's usually one or two species making up the bulk of that, which is kind of interesting. Last year happened the same way. We counted about just a little over 11,000 individual birds. A third of that were common redpolls. We had almost 4,000 common redpolls last year. So really kind of fun, especially when you contrast that with a low year, 1991. Was I born? I was born in that count, I think. But a cold year, I would have guessed again. Another cold year, another year with no finch movement, probably a year where the lake was pretty frozen. Because waterfowl, you can really crank up numbers if you have a lot of ducks around. So kind of fun just to generally look at those numbers. Again, they don't really mean a lot unless we standardize it, and we can kind of appreciate why those numbers were the way that they are. But the significant things, right? So 73 species in 2001 is significant. I would be curious to know myself what happened in the broader Minnesota Christmas counts that year. You can look at some of that data. It would just take you a long time to sort it out. On the Minnesota Ornithologists Union website, you can find all of the data for all of the Christmas bird counts, as far back as however long they keep the records. But for us, at least, when I think of significant records, I'm thinking of species that are significant because we've only seen a couple of them. Maybe they were significant in the greater Christmas bird count realm in Minnesota. Maybe they were significant because we saw a whole bunch of them, right? So let's take a look at a few of these things. And this is our first bird we're going to consider. This is obviously not the photo. I got almost all the photos here from eBird. So again, none of my photos in case you were hoping to see those. But loggerhead shrike. We have a loggerhead shrike. We have one record of loggerhead shrike on the Duluth Christmas bird count. Surprisingly to me, there are more than one winter record of loggerhead shrike. This is a southern species, and we expect northern shrikes in the winter. There are at least 10 records in Minnesota over the winter for loggerhead shrike, which was a huge surprise for me. So I don't know if this was our only Christmas bird count record for loggerhead shrike in Minnesota, because there are a few records around the Twin Cities, and so I suspect that there's probably a shrike in a circle in the Twin Cities. So loggerhead shrike, really interesting bird for us. We're going to start from the least rare to the most rare. I should also let you know. So loggerhead shrike. Second bird, king eider. Certainly, we never see king eiders that look like this in Minnesota. Unfortunately, most of our records in Minnesota are females or young males that have not molted into their adult plumage. We have one record of king eider on the Duluth Christmas bird count. There are a lot of winter records in Minnesota, but this is the only Christmas bird count record. The Duluth king eider is the only one for a Minnesota Christmas bird count. You'll sense a trend here, because Pacific loon, another bird we get a lot of winter records of along the North Shore, but our Pacific loon is the only Christmas bird count record for Minnesota. So we've got one Pacific loon. It's the only record on any Minnesota Christmas bird count. That really surprised me was western grebe. This is not the only Christmas bird count record for western grebe. We have one, and Two Harbors has one. So there are about 11 winter records of western grebe in Minnesota. Two of them appeared on Christmas bird counts. I think the western grebe in Two Harbors stayed almost a full 2 months. It stayed a long time. That was in the early 2000s. So a pretty rare bird for us, but surprisingly not terribly rare in Minnesota in the winter, which was a surprise to me. So western grebe. Oh, green-tailed towhee. So green-tailed towhee, again, we have the only Christmas bird count record in Minnesota for green-tailed towhee. And our green-tailed towhee was one of 3 winter records in Minnesota. So there have only been 2 other records of this bird in the winter in Minnesota. And we've got one of them, and it appeared on our Christmas bird count. So getting rarer now. The next species is tufted duck. We have one of 2 winter records in Minnesota of this bird, and it is the only one to appear in a Christmas bird count, at least in Minnesota. So very, very rare. I will tell you now, the next 3 or 4 birds are the only winter records in Minnesota, and they are the only Christmas bird count records in Minnesota, the following species. One of them being common eider. This, I tried to get better photos for this one because our record was the same subspecies as this. So this is the Bering Sea subspecies of common eider. It was also a female. She was a really lovely bird. If you didn't see her, this would have been maybe 2017, I think she was around. An absolutely lovely bird, but she made it on our Christmas count, the only winter record in Minnesota, the only Christmas bird count record in Minnesota, common eider for the Duluth count. Maybe the most surprising is this bird. This is a Dunlin. Minnesota has the only Christmas bird count record, or the Duluth count has the only Minnesota Christmas bird count record. It is also the only winter record in Minnesota. It is also the furthest north winter record ever in the central United States. Dunlins winter on the coasts, so they can go up to Massachusetts or further north than that on the coast. But once you get into the interior, this is a bird that does not overwinter. They need to go south. They're not like snipe. So Wilson snipe will very occasionally overwinter in the Twin Cities or along a little seep if you've got some wet, kind of boggy stuff on your property. Snipe will stick around for a very long time, but not Dunlins. So that bird was a crazy record, probably the craziest record we have, unless you consider the next bird, which is black-headed grosbeak. The only Christmas bird count record in Minnesota is the Duluth count. The only winter record in Minnesota was the bird that we found a few years ago for black-headed grosbeak. So some crazy, crazy birds that we have seen on our count, but these are sort of the select few that I think are the most exciting. But of course, there's some honorable mentions, right? We can't have a best list without acknowledging some cool things. We've got 9 species of gull on our Christmas bird count. We've got 9 species of owl on our Christmas bird count in Duluth. We also almost have 9 species of woodpecker. We're missing red-headed woodpecker. We've never had a record of red-headed woodpecker on our count. And that's our last woodpecker. That's the last regularly occurring woodpecker in Minnesota that we need. The last couple of years, there has been a pair nesting over by Indian Point. So maybe one of these years they'll stay and then they'll come east a little ways so they're in our count circle so we can count them. But red-headed woodpecker is the only one missing. Terribly surprising to me was this: 14 species of sparrow. I couldn't believe we had that many. Many of them we only have 2 or 3 records of. There are only really 2 that we see routinely and regularly, but 14 species of sparrow was great. And 4 species of warbler I thought was really good. Of those, 2 we probably could guess what are. Pine warbler, yellow-rumped warbler, both of those species overwinter in Minnesota regularly. The one that doesn't, though, is Cape May warbler. We have a winter record of Cape May warbler on our Christmas bird count, which is unbelievable. If you think about Cape May warblers, they are basically nectar feeders in the winter. So in South America, they're eating nectar from flowers and bugs and things. But they do come to suet feeders every so often. If we have a really cold spring, you might see them using a hummingbird feeder, but if you keep suet out, you might see Cape Mays at a suet feeder too. So really cool. The 4th warbler, orange-crowned warbler. That's a bird that is another cold tolerant species, will sometimes overwinter much further north than you'd expect them to be. Just some last highlights with the recent additions. Some rarities: Carolina wren, eastern screech owl, but maybe not so rare birds. Wild turkey has only appeared on the last 3 Christmas bird counts. This is a species that I don't think we will miss again. And I also think it's a species that we will see many, many, many more of in the next few years. There's some trends that we'll observe here in a second that might help us explain wild turkey, but some pretty cool additions there. And so in my sort of analysis and looking things over, I've come across a few things. And so what we're going to kind of look through are just the general breakdown, right? When we do a compilation, we break down the species that we ask about based on how many or how frequently we've seen them on account. So for example, we've got a group where we have species we've seen at least 25% of the time. So right now that's at least 10 counts. And then we bump it up to at least 21 counts, and then species we've seen every time. So that's how we're going to treat it. And then we're going to look at some weird numbers after that. So we have observed 71 species at least 25% of the time. So this includes birds we've seen at a minimum of 10 times and at a maximum of 42 times. So that's about half of the species we've seen on the whole count we might expect maybe every couple of years or so. There are two species on the list that are really close. If this was an odd year, so if this was count year 41, I would jump those two up, so we'd count them in the next numbers. But golden crowned kinglet has been seen 20 times. Same thing with hoary redpoll. Both have been seen 20 of the last 42 Christmas bird counts. So they're really close to jumping up to the next bracket. And in this group that has been seen at least 25% of the time, there's one species that we don't see anymore on our counts. I'm going to let you think about it for a second. That bird, ringneck pheasant. We don't see ringneck pheasants anymore on the Duluth Christmas bird count. Part of the reason is that they're no longer a countable species in St. Louis County, so they don't breed in St. Louis County freely anymore. Historically, this was a bird that you could find in Port Terminal, just nesting. They were around, they were nesting, and they were just there. And so I don't think we've had a ringneck pheasant on the count since maybe 1984 or 5. Which, if you were around here then, coincides with kind of cleaning up the Port Terminal area and Canal Park and making sure all the spilt grain wasn't on the ground anymore. And so then we lost the food source for those pheasants, and then we lost them. This is not a bird that should survive up here without any help. And so again, they just shouldn't kind of be around anyways. So ringneck pheasant, we don't see them anymore. That's the reason why. If we take away sort of those lower birds and think about only higher observations, so species that we've seen at least 21 of the last 42 times, are 55 species. So a little bit smaller list, but we could reasonably expect them every other count or so. In that group, we've had two species that we've missed only one time, mourning dove and pine siskin. We've only missed those species once in the last 42 Christmas bird counts. So they just are barely on the list there. And then there are 3 other species that we've seen almost every count in the last 42. And that's red-tailed hawk, mallard, and northern shrike. We've only missed those birds twice in the last 42 counts, which is pretty exciting. If you think that's weird that we see so many red tails on this count, they like to hang out at WLSSD. So they like to hang out by Cortlandt Street there. Eating the mice and pigeons all winter long. There's always a couple around, and they have been for the last many counts. So, but the exciting group, the overachievers, the birds we've never missed in the last 42 counts, 18 species. There are 18 species that we have never missed in the last 42 counts. 4 of those species, if we go way back into the data, have only been missed one time since 1938. And of that group, only 1 species has been seen on every single Christmas bird count in Duluth since 1938. I'm going to let you guess what the last 2 groups are. So who are the 4 that we've missed only once, and what species have we never missed from our list? So here they are. Here are the 18 species we've never missed. Common goldeneye. Common goldeneye, never been missed in the last 42 counts. Even when we had the really frozen cold year on Lake Superior, when the whole thing froze over, we didn't miss common goldeneye. There was enough open water to hold that bird. Common merganser, another bird that we've never missed in 42 counts. Sort of like goldeneyes, they're kind of dependent on open water, but we'll always seem to find a couple. Ruffed grouse, maybe a surprise. We are a pretty urban count. But like I said, there is some part of the circle on the north end, especially, that sees a lot of ruffed grouse. This is a bird that we've come very close to missing a few times, though, mostly because they can be really hard to find if it's windy in the morning and you have to stay out really late or get up really early to find them in the winter usually. So sometimes we get really close to missing them. But most of the time we count around a dozen or so. So a nice bird, never been missed in the last 42 counts. Herring gull, never been missed. Maybe not a terrible surprise. It's one of the few birds that we can see down by the ice, even when it's totally frozen over. So herring gull is on the list. Downy woodpecker hasn't been missed in 42 counts. Again, maybe not a terrible surprise. If you've got a bird feeder, you probably have a downy woodpecker, even if you're in town. They're very adaptable to urban areas. They're very adaptable to the wild spaces further afield. There are actually 3 woodpeckers on this list: downy woodpecker, hairy woodpecker, and pileated woodpecker. We haven't missed them in the last 42 counts. They've never been missed in those 42 counts, which is really good. We'll talk more about the woodpeckers because there's some really weird things in the data when you look at all of the woodpeckers. So we're going to check that out in just a second here. Blue jay, maybe not a terrible surprise that we've never missed blue jay in the last 42 counts. There are 2 other corvids, as you might guess: American crow and common raven, also haven't been missed in the last 42 counts. I would suspect of this group that blue jay should be one to watch. We had a huge fall flight of blue jays this year. We had over 60,000 blue jays migrate this year. I still have a couple around my neighborhood here, so there's a few around still, but they might move out by the winter, so we'll see what they do. This might be an interesting year for blue jays. But crows and ravens, we'll always see them, those lovely birds. Black-capped chickadee, again, maybe not a terrible surprise. I sure hope you see chickadees all winter long. I really hope you do. So not a terrible surprise we haven't missed them in 42 counts. This one, though, well, not this one, the next one. Red-breasted nuthatch, kind of in the same realm as the woodpeckers and black-capped chickadee. Very well adapted to the winter. Not a terrible surprise that we've not missed them in 42 counts. Is it this one? No, it's not this one. Well, it is this one a little bit. White-breasted nuthatch. This is a bird that I never associate with northern Minnesota. And maybe that's because I grew up in southern Minnesota and I spent a lot of time in deciduous woods. But this is not a bird that I would say we have had every count in the last 42 counts. I wouldn't have said this bird was on the list going into this. So white-breasted nuthatch, just like this one. American robin has not been missed in the last 42 counts. And it's unbelievable to me. When I was looking into this data, this was probably the most surprised out of all of the birds in this 18 species long list. I couldn't believe that this was one that we have not missed in 42 counts. We certainly have a lot of fruit trees. There's a lot of food for them, but usually the Bohemian waxwings take care of it, or the pine grosbeaks take care of it. There's usually not a lot of food around for robins once we get deep into the winter, so we usually don't see them, but we've not missed one in 42 counts. And dark-eyed junco, the last of our native species to have not been missed on a Christmas bird count in Duluth in the last 42 counts, which leaves us 3 more birds: rock pigeon, European starling, and house sparrow. We have not missed those birds either. Maybe not a terrible surprise. They're good at surviving, and so maybe it's not a surprise we haven't missed them. But if we look at some trends and we look at the whole list, those 18 full species, there are 4, like I said, that have only been missed 1 time. I was going to have us interact, but I only have 10 minutes in my talk to go. So I'm just going to tell you, take a second, see which 4 you might think. And here we go. 4 species that have not, or have only been missed 1 time since 1938. They are: common goldeneye has only been missed once since 1938. Herring gull has only been missed once since 1948, or 1938, excuse me. Black-capped chickadee, surprisingly enough, has been missed on 1 count. I'm pretty sure that's a clerical error because I can't believe this is a bird that we've missed 1 time. I can't believe it. It was in 1939. So if anybody's got information about the 1939 Duluth Christmas bird count, I would love that information because this bird was not on the list and I can't believe it. The other bird that we've missed once, hairy woodpecker, has only been missed once. And so my brain said, oh, chickadee got missed. That's probably where that hairy woodpecker got missed. Nope, different count. It was in the 1940s, I think 1942. So maybe, maybe not enough people counting at that time, but that leaves us with one bird. So who the heck is it, right? From that list of 18, we've just taken away 4. There's one bird that should be our winter birding mascot for the city of Duluth. Downy woodpecker. Downy woodpecker has never been missed. Since 1938, this bird has appeared on every single Duluth Christmas bird count that has taken place in the area. Downy woodpecker has never been missed, which is pretty cool. I mean, I was hoping chickadee would be on that list too, but it's downy woodpecker. That's the bird. That's our bird. That's our winter bird, believe it or not. So downy woodpecker. So trends, if we look at the trends now, I only picked out a few. And again, we have some caveats in our analysis. Number one, we should remember that there aren't very apparent or obvious declines in the species that we have observed in the count. Certainly it gets a little harder when you only see 2 or 3 birds, per species in some individuals. So again, that's why we're taking a look at 1980 until now. And really only on the species that we've never missed in that period. I think I take some numbers from a couple of other places too, but we're going to look at who has been increasing. We're going to look at some really cool interspecific relationships in the data, which may or may not mean anything, but I think they do. And then a couple of oddballs. And then we'll kind of get to our end here. So there are declines though. I said there aren't any, but there is a couple, mostly explainable, I will say. There are 2 species. Both of those species are declining for the same reason, and both of them are not native. So, sigh of relief. It's house sparrow and it is rock pigeon. Both of those species have a huge dip. Again, sort of that late 80s, early 90s, very explainable, has had to do with cleaning up Canal Park, cleaning up Port Terminal area. Once all that food went away, they couldn't sustain a high population, and so they just kind of normalized at a lower level. We're not terribly worried about these 2 birds. They're not native species. They are still surviving. We are still counting them, but we are not counting them to the volume that we did historically. Interestingly enough, it did not have any effect, at least in my cursory look, at any of our overwintering birds of prey. So I thought for sure we'd see a drop in observations of peregrine falcon, of cheer falcon, maybe red tails even. Hasn't affected those numbers, which is interesting. There are a few species that are increasing though. One of them is American crow. Take a look at that. This is count 1 here would be 1980. And so from 1980 on, whoop, huge increase in American crows. That's really lovely. Recently, it's kind of stabilized. This is a bird that doesn't deal well with West Nile virus. And so I potentially would suspect this might be a dip from West Nile. Again, there's a lot of interpretation to do in this data, but generally American crow is increasing. Certainly if we look at count effort, I bet we can get clean this up a little bit and get some better curves to it, but a species that is very obviously increasing from maybe around 100 or less in the early 80s to almost 1,000. That's a pretty cool increase from this bird. One of the most obvious increases out of all of our birds that I looked at when I was considering this data. But there is a trio of birds that is also increasing. And I said we're going to talk about woodpeckers. Let's talk about woodpeckers because hairy woodpecker, red-bellied woodpecker, and pileated woodpeckers are all increasing. Notably here on the bottom, this is our red-bellied woodpecker line. Notice that they didn't even start showing up into counts until I think that's 1999 was the first year that they started to show up consistently on our counts. And then as you can see, they've just been increasing. Boop, 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 boop. The last 2 years, we've almost had record numbers of red-bellied woodpecker. Same could be said for pileated woodpecker. You can see starting in 1980, very low numbers of pileys, and then all of a sudden we started to see more, and then more, and then more. Both of those birds are typically southern species, and have kind of had some luck. Pileated woodpecker, I think that's a little more explainable when we look at forest type, and just having more old trees means you're going to have more pileated woodpeckers. And so time would sort of say that we should have more. But hairy woodpecker, this is a really weird one because look at all these peaks. Lots of peaks, lots of valleys in that number. But I noticed something when I was looking at woodpeckers. Oops, not yet. We're going to notice that later. If we look at species groups in particular, finches, of course, we have a lot of ways to interpret finch data. This is looking at evening grosbeak, purple finch, pine siskin, and pine grosbeak. If we put all of their numbers together, what I hope you notice are these three big tall spires: pine siskin, pine siskin, pine siskin. Huge numbers of pine siskins. When we get pine siskins, we get a lot of pine siskins on our count. But if you look nestled, oh, there's another peak. So this is a peak for purple finch. If we look over here, this is a peak for evening grosbeak. If you have keen eyes and you spotted this peak and this peak, this is just showing that usually when we have an eruptive finch, we probably have another one. And if we look at the relationship, at least between evening grosbeak, purple finch, and pine siskin, all three of those species have the same summer foods. And so we might expect them to move in the same numbers, or at least relative numbers, right? And so we can look at that closer, and we can see, we can look at those peaks a little bit closer and see, yeah, if we look at it, purple finch, pine siskin, makes sense. They're both spruce specialists in the summer. It makes sense where you have a big exodus of one of those species from a region, you might see that in another species. Same thing with evening grosbeak and pine siskin down here at this point. You have about equal numbers of both of those species leaving an area and coming to another place. Both of them eat the same things in the summer, which is really cool. So I said woodpeckers have interesting relationships. This is our same four: red-bellied, hairy, pileated, plus downy woodpecker. And what is really hard to see is that there is some lineup and some overlap with the peaks and the valleys. So if we look close, and we put some bars out here, there's peaks that line, or valleys that line up, another valley that lines up, a peak that lines up, valley, peak, and so on. And so I'm very curious, because I think there's an explanation to this. In my guiding that I've done in the area, whenever we have really windy days, it is very difficult to find woodpeckers. For some reason or the other, it's just really difficult. You could look for downies or hairies or whatever you're looking for. It's very hard to find them. So I have a sneaking suspicion that in each of those little valleys there, when we see a decline in downies, we usually see it in hairies, we usually see it in pillies. There it is, there it is, there it is, there it is. When we see increases, though, we also usually see it. So I don't know how to explain that yet, but I suspect that in the wind, we usually don't see as many woodpeckers. And I'm curious to see if that plays out, or if there's something else that explains it. Maybe those were cold patches. But anyways, there is a relationship, and they behave the same way, which is really cool. Oop, there's one more. This is a duck graph, and I put this one out because what was going on here? Why were there no ducks around? I have no clue. I have no clue why from 1980 to about 1993, we didn't have any goldeneyes or mallards. I have no clue why that would have happened. But then you can see once we started getting them, boy, we got a lot of them, which is really an interesting thing. This, if you see this big, huge decline here in goldeneyes, that was totally due to the lake freezing over. This was the year it froze, and then we didn't see any, and then we didn't see any because a lot of those birds died. A lot of goldeneyes died when the lake froze over because they didn't have anywhere to go. They would fly out over the lake and there was no water, which means they couldn't find any food, which means they kept flying around and they couldn't find it and couldn't find it. And then it ended up killing them. And so we're just sort of seeing an increase. If you look at our little tail here, we're creeping back up to goldeneye numbers. So I'm very excited to look at this map when I have weather too, because I bet there's some explanations here, or maybe not. The last two I've got are oddballs. And I love these ones. And I really love this one. What is going on here? Why did we have no black ducks from 1980 all the way to about 1994? We had no black ducks. And I don't know why. That's sort of the same window, if you remember from the other duck maps, when we didn't have any golden eyes or mallards either. The count circle hasn't changed. So I'm curious what was going on. So if anybody has any idea, let me know, because I'm very curious what was going on in 1980 to 1993. Why were there no ducks here? I have no clue. But it's also, yeah, a huge variation. Look at that. It's the messiest map of most of the birds. Sometimes we'll have lots of black ducks. Sometimes we won't have any. Sometimes there's a lot, and then there's none, and then there's a lot. I don't know what to explain that from. I think it's probably due to the identification issues with American black duck. They're not a terribly difficult bird to identify, but a lot of people do have trouble with them. And so I suspect that maybe there was some unfamiliar people counting potentially. I don't know, but I don't know what's going on from 1980 to 1994. I'd really love to know that. But this was the biggest surprise. So this is black-capped chickadees. And I looked at this map and I said, okay, it looks just like every other graph that I've seen with any other bird that we see a lot of. There's ups and downs, and it goes. But part of looking at conservation and being a conservation biologist and understanding that the lows are the really important thing to understand, I started looking at the valleys here. And I said to myself, well, that's kind of weird. What's going on here? It turns out that we see a low point, a valley in the black-capped chickadee observations on our count about every 5 years. It works out to an average of 4.86. Every 4.86 years, we have a decline and we have a low in black-capped chickadee counts. I have no idea why. I haven't yet looked into literature to see if there's somebody who's been studying this, but every 5 years, you can see there's some gaps, right? So this was a 6-year gap, and then there was a 4-year gap, but 5, 5, 5, 3, 5, 6. That's pretty consistent. So again, when we standardize this with some count effort data, I suspect this will clean it up a little bit, but I bet we'll still see those lows. And I'm very curious to see why. So this was probably my most exciting find in the data, was seeing that, yeah, we have lows. And also, if you look what's happening here, we're on a little bit of a drop with chickadee numbers right now. So in the next 2 to 3 to 4 years, we'll hit another low point more than likely, and then we'll probably go back up again, which is super interesting to me. It's one of the, like I said, one of the most exciting things I found poking around with these numbers. And certainly this is not an exhaustive list, right? There's certainly more data to look through. I'm very excited to do so because it helps kind of inform the process, right? It says, hey, we're doing a really good job and we're seeing some really cool things. And it's all because of people, right? People who are involved, who are participating, right? And so if you're now super excited, right? You just heard me talk about Christmas bird count numbers for an hour, and you want to get involved, here's how you can do it. First off, determine if you live near a count circle, right? You don't have to live in a circle to participate in a circle. So let's say you have folks you visit down in southern Minnesota, and there's a count circle where they live. You could participate in that count potentially. But it also just gives you an idea of what might be around you, right? If you've never looked into it, maybe you don't know. Maybe, oh, hey, there's room for a count here. I could start one up myself, right? Once you find that circle, find the compiler. So contact the compiler and say, hey, I'm interested in participating. Can I, in what capacity, you know, all that. And then do what you feel like you can. You could be out all day long. You could do one area in a circle. You might do 3 or 4 or 5 different Christmas bird counts in a year. Maybe you only do feeder reports. Totally fine. But there's lots of different ways to participate, which is a really exciting thing. And these 3 places are the best places to go to find that data. So you could go to our website, the Duluth Audubon website, go to the events tab and scroll all the way down to the bottom. Once you're at the bottom, you will find the Christmas bird count. You can click on it and it will take you to the Minnesota Ornithologists Union website, where you can see our count and how to contact me to get active in that count. All of the Minnesota counts are housed on the Minnesota Ornithologists Union website. And so we'll look at that in a second. And the National Audubon website also has all of the counts in Minnesota. I will say the National Audubon website is a little clunky. It's a little hard to use. So I would say go to the MOU page. And when you go to that page, You can find under other resources on the left-hand side, it brings you to Christmas bird counts. And here, you can see whatever you want. You can learn the history of Minnesota's Christmas bird counts. You can contact or join a Christmas bird count. If you click on that, it takes you to this map. And once you're to this map, then you can click on any one of those circles and it will take you to a specific page that gives you the compiler information, and it gives you the count date, the diameter of that circle, where it includes, all that sort of stuff you can find there. Audubon's page also does that. So here's Duluth, Superior, the Carleton Cloquet count, Friedenberg, the Bog, Two Harbors, etc. It's a little different, but it's still the same circles. You click on a circle, it tells you who's leading the count, tells you how to get into contact with them. If you notice, though, there are different colors here. So red, those note invite only or closed counts, which means they are not open to the public necessarily. So if you wanted to participate in this count, we don't have a place where you meet and show up and get your route. You have to contact me to participate in that count, just like the Sparky counts. So the Bog count and the Carleton County count, they're sort of invite only. Same thing with the Isabella count. There's a few counts that do it that way. Any green count, open to the public, also has a date set. Yellow, open to the public, but does not have a date set. So you can learn a lot just by looking at that circle. Ultimately, right, we want to have fun. This is a total citizen science effort. This is totally just people going out and doing it. This is not like a Cornell-based thing. It's not based at the University of Minnesota. It's a total citizen science-based thing, which is really great. If you like to look at birds and you want to share your observations, Christmas bird counts are a great way to do it. Great way to interact with the local bird communities especially, but also go somewhere else and do a count, right? You could go to Florida and do a couple of Christmas counts. You can go out east, out west. In a year, I usually do 4, at least 3. I've done up to 4 in a season. I know folks who do at least 5, if not 6. So it's really fun. It really is. And once you catch the bug, it sort of sucks you in. And so again, totally have fun with it. Do it how you want to do it. Go ski for a while and count birds. Go on your snowshoes. Like, there's a lot of ways to do it up here that can be fun, other than driving around in a car all day long. And so if you've got questions for me, we'll take them right now. There might be some in the chat there, but email me, send me an email, because in the next couple of weeks here, I'm going to be sending out an interest email just to make sure, hey, if you've got an area already, are you going to do it again? If not, I need to have people fill that. And so if you are interested and you want to participate in the full count, let me know. If you are interested and you want to just be a feeder watcher and you live in the circle, let me know. I love that. Feeder watchers are so important because there are a lot of yards that we can't see as birders, and we don't like to stand in front of somebody's house and stare at their house with our binoculars. So if you've got feeders and you live in the count circle in Duluth here, let me know. I would love to add your numbers to my list. 3 or 4 chickadees might not seem like a lot, but it does matter. It really does, especially if you have a cool bird hanging out. The last couple of years, people have had brown thrashers. There's been an eastern bluebird at somebody's feeder, a couple of flickers. I think, Vicki, you had a flicker at your feeder. So, there's some good value to feeder watchers. So let me know. This count is going to be the 17th of December. So that date is set. Generally speaking, the Two Harbors count is the next day. So the 18th of December, if you want to participate in that count, I can get you in contact with Jim. But yeah, I'm happy to answer questions. If you've got them, if you just want to email me with those questions, there you go. Send me an email. It's right there on the screen for you. I'm happy to take those questions and happy to have them whenever you've got them. So I'm just going to quick look in the chat here for a couple of questions, and if you've got them, other ones, let me know. The one question that I have right away that I'll take. Have you compared black-capped chickadee trends with other nearby Christmas counts to see if there are similar dips? I have not. Not all counts keep the same data, and I also don't have access to all that data. Sometimes I could, so since I know Jim, I could say, hey, Jim, can I see your chickadee numbers? He would send me those and I could look at it further. But it is something that I'm very curious about. I wasn't expecting to see any patterns at all, and that was a pretty obvious one even without standardizing it. So I'm very curious to see what happens if there are trends like that, or if there's a Minnesota trend. I'd be very curious to see. So great question. Thank you so much. And thanks for the note about National Weather Service, because I absolutely confirm my data when I submit numbers to folks. I confirm that with National Weather Service. So thank you so much. I will dig into that a little bit later. So are there other questions? Jeff, do you want folks to unmute to ask questions if they've got them? How are we feeling there?
That would be great. Unmute yourself if you have any questions or observations yourself.
Yeah.
I have a question.
All right.
We have cardinals during the winter, and I was surprised that you had none in your report.
Mostly because they aren't terribly significant. So not that they're not significant, right? Because they are. We see them, and we have seen them basically every count in the last 24 years we've had cardinals or so. They do a weird thing that I wasn't suspecting. So I talked a little bit about red-bellied woodpecker and pileated woodpecker, right? Being southern species and increasing. I was expecting to see that out of cardinals. They did not do that. What they did was they had a year where we had 130 cardinals on account. I don't know how that happened or where they came from, but then they leveled back out. So there was this weird bell curve with northern cardinal. And so I suspect that was probably like a colonization event where you had a lot of birds that just were moving north, and then they survived, and then they kept moving north. Because we do have cardinals up the shore. So Two Harbors has cardinals on their count. Grand Marais has cardinals on their count. They're becoming more common. And so again, maybe we do see that in the next few years, where we do see a bit of an increasing trend. But so far we don't. It is a bird that we have seen at least in the last 42 counts at over 50% of the time. And recently we haven't missed them. We haven't missed them for a number of years. And so it's really cool though, because that was a bird historically, you go back to the 40s and 50s, there weren't cardinals. They weren't even on the list. Within the last 30 years, that's a bird that has arrived, which is pretty cool.
Clinton.
Yeah.
It's Jane Hovland. I'm wondering if you have snow depth data.
I do, yes.
You do.
Or I could. That is one of the data points that we collect.
Yeah.
So
it's so interesting when the snow is really deep. What happens to some of the smaller seed feeders or coppers on the ground?
Yeah.
To use scientific terms.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. Yeah. I would bet. And so again, that's why I really want this data. I know it's somewhere. I just don't have it all. I don't have access to it. But the state compiler does. And if I had to ask Audubon for it, they would probably give it to me too. Because I would bet that we would see cardinals, juncos, white-throated sparrow, species like that. I bet we would see pretty low numbers, and we would see pretty high feeder bird numbers, right? A lot more chickadees or nuthatches showing up at feeders as opposed to being found out, in the spruce stands or something like that. Yeah, I'm curious. I'm going to note snow depth down because I haven't thought about snow depth when I was doing this. I was mostly thinking temperature and things, but I will check snow depth too. Awesome. Other questions for me?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. Nice presentation, Clinton. It's always great to see the numbers. The other thing that's fascinating to me with this stuff, and part of the reason for doing it more than just fun, is Audubon has had more than 300 peer-reviewed publications, scientific papers put out from this data. So yes, it's fun and it's a great time and I love doing them, but there is some really good things that come out of it too.
Absolutely. It's a direct impact by citizens on really robust science. So absolutely. Yeah. That's really good. Other questions, notes, observations? Are we sure? Are we double sure? Okay. Well, if you've got questions, my email's right there. I'm happy to take them on the count on participating, especially if you're interested in participating. Like I said, this count is a hard one because we have a lot of longevity in areas, so people don't like to share. But lately we've had a lot of turnover. There's people who can't do counts anymore or have left the area. And so there's a couple areas right now that I think are probably open. So let me know if you're interested in participating or if you're interested in feeder watching. I'd love to hear about it. So thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you. We appreciate you and your work. And thanks to everybody for